That was Senator Ernest Hollings yesterday on Capitol Hill talking about the GATT agreement, which is coming up shortly in Congress. Tim Weiner is Washington correspondent for the New York Times. In a general sense, in the wake of the Ames spy case, what's the health of the CIA?
Well, people are worried. People at the agency are worried for their future. People who care about intelligence and its role in helping the United States make coherent foreign policy are worried. And there's a good deal of discontent and ferment in Congress about whether the CIA and whether the entire U.S. intelligence community.
How will that congressional discontent manifest itself?
Congress, in its wisdom, has decided that a commission of 17 people, 9 to be appointed by the White House and 8 to be appointed by Congress, should take a look at all U.S. intelligence agencies. That's not just the CIA, but 11 other military and civilian agencies, several of which are far bigger than the CIA, and sort of go back to the future, go back to 1947 in many ways when this structure was created and the CIA was born, and rethink the role of each agency and perhaps rethink what the meaning of national security is after the Cold War.
Roy Godson is president of the National Strategy Information Center. How do you assess the health of the CIA in the wake of the Ames case?
Well, if I can just sort of put it in the whole context of the future of intelligence in the CIA and then come to the Ames case, I think it's natural that we have this debate in the country. We and other democracies tend not to believe that we need intelligence in the absence of a clear and present danger, of an overwhelming threat. And so the history of intelligences in democracies in the 20th century is one where the moment they don't have a clear and present danger, they tend to downgrade and usually eliminate their intelligence capability. That we have actually been so much more prudent after the Cold War this time is really quite surprising and actually quite gratifying that we seem to have matured as a democracy and do not believe that we should abolish most of our intelligence capabilities as we did after World War I and as we did after World War II, only to find that we had to recreate a whole lot of things in 47, 48, and so on. So that it's natural for democracy to have this review of its activities. Now, with regard to the specifics of the Ames case, I think the Ames case does illustrate that we have deep-seated problems in some parts of the intelligence community. I don't think there's anything new about this. I think people pointed this out a long time ago. Like, for example, in the 1980s, we had a whole revelation about weaknesses in American counterintelligence. You recall it was the decade of the spy. And in the late 1980s, I think we saw some of the most creative thinking about counterintelligence that this country has ever undertaken. And there was a review of counterintelligence both in the Congress and in the executive branch. The media played a major role in highlighting this debate, and we came up with some reforms. I think, as I said, those were very far-reaching, creative reforms. Unfortunately, the managers of these reforms, much as they were very creative, didn't always implement their own reforms. And the Ames case begins sort of in the middle of when they were beginning to realize they have a problem. They start to institute the reforms, but they didn't actually institute them well enough to catch him early enough, in my view. And so really they're paying a price now for something they were aware of, but they didn't pay enough attention to back in the late 80s, early 1990s. But there were a number of other successes, and I think as we talk about the Ames case, we ought to also remember that we had a number of counterintelligence successes. I'd point to, for example, the catching, not the arrest, but the catching of Felix Bloch, which was, I think, a fairly brilliant counterintelligence success. There were a number of other cases that the DCI referred to yesterday, which in many cases resulted from hard, good counterintelligence work and some of the reforms that were instituted in the late 1980s. So I think we're in for a debate, a discussion. I think it's healthy in a democracy to consider the role of counterintelligence in a democracy, but I'm glad to say I think we've matured enough not to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Tim Weiner, you mentioned earlier a congressional response meeting yesterday on the Hill with congressional and intelligence leaders. Who was in that meeting and what came from it?
Well, Jim Woolsey, the Director of Central Intelligence, and his Inspector General went to the House Intelligence Committee, one of the two that oversee CIA, and gave their report on the Ames case and Mr. Woolsey's decision that while 11 retired and present officers would be reprimanded. No one would be dismissed or demoted for the case. Mr. Woolsey read a long statement on the case, which he also read to some reporters on the record yesterday, and discussed an almost unbelievable series of failures largely within the operations directorate of CIA, where the spies work, and also in its Office of Security, in which this drunken, bumbling, rule-breaking, standards-flouting man, Rick Ames, somehow managed to be promoted and promoted and promoted again, and finally, though he was ranked at the very bottom of his cohort of 200 officers, selected to serve on a panel for promotion to decide who got promoted in the CIA. Mr. Woolsey said one could almost believe that not only was no one paying attention to the fact that the CIA knew it had a traitor within and knew that virtually its entire network of double agents behind the Iron Curtain had been rolled up and many of those agents killed. One could almost believe that not only was no one paying attention, but that no one cared. Those were his words.
Roy Godson, as you look at this case, this series of failures, is it because of people, or is it an institutional situation that led to this?
Well, you know, we don't have all the data. We're only picking up bits and pieces here, so it's hard to be sure that we understand these things. One of the things in the intelligence business is it takes a while to peel back the onion so you understand all the pieces behind it. But from what we know, I think now, and what the sort of consensus that seems to be developing amongst the people who've read the report, who've seen it, who've been discussing this issue now for some months, is that it's both the combination of some people and a culture. As I said, this culture and the weaknesses in this culture were pointed out some time ago. There is nothing terribly new here. What sort of really new is just the dramatics of the case and how bad this particular case is. But we've known about this problem for some time in the culture. I mean, a number of scholars and intelligence practitioners back in the 1980s, even during the Carter administration, pointed to problems in this culture. Then in the 1980s, as I said, we had a lot of counterintelligence failures, agreement that we were going to reform the system. And as I said, so one can sort of lay some blame, if you wish, put it in that way, on the system that wasn't reformed very well. And then one also, I think, also has to sort of address the question of why didn't the Congress pay more attention to this problem. I think the administration of the times, the Reagan-Bush administration, the early Clinton administration, one can sort of lay off some blame, if you will, on them. One can lay off some blame on the DCIs at the time for not paying enough attention to the weaknesses which were pointed out to them, which they admitted at the time. But one also has to say, I mean, we have two oversight committees on the Congress. We instituted a major reform in the 1970s. We created two oversights. We have the greatest oversight of any intelligence system ever in the history of the world. And one has to ask why the Congressional Intelligence Committees, having pointed to the weaknesses, didn't monitor the performance of the agencies themselves. So what my point really is here, there's a sort of a number of agencies, a number of parts of government have to take some of the responsibility. One doesn't want to blame just a few individuals or one particular place. But I think collectively, we as a society have to keep monitoring this. And by the way, if we don't keep monitoring it into the future, we'll be having this discussion again in 5 or 10 years as we had it 5 or 10 years ago.
Good morning and welcome as we continue our discussion focusing on the CIA and its future and recent news stories about what's been happening with the Ames case. We invite you to join us. You'll see the numbers at the bottom of the screen for your phone calls, and also if you'd like to fax in a question or a comment. We just ask, though, if you've called in the past 30 days, to please wait, and that way others can get in a little bit more easily. Our guests this morning are Roy Godson, who is president of the National Strategy Information Center. What is the center?
Center is a think tank, public policy center, as we call them in Washington, that lives off foundation grants, private organization. In our case, we study intelligence as a subject. We take it seriously as a public policy issue in a democracy, and we don't think it's something that you know, shouldn't escape the attention, the scrutiny that other public policy centers put into economic policy, housing policy, and other aspects of foreign policy.
Also joining us this morning, Tim Weiner, who's Washington correspondent for the New York Times. We saw his headline earlier. You mentioned earlier James Woolsey's on-the-record comments yesterday. Let me ask you about on-the-record off in this particular story. How difficult or easy is it to cover this story and the CIA in general?
It has not been terribly easy. Very little about CIA and its operations is public, and in the opinion of most people in the government, very little should be public. Its budget is secret, its the number of personnel are secret, certainly its internal machinations are secret. However, the problems of the CIA have often spilled over into the federal courts and into the criminal justice system in recent months, and that provides a window, for example, into the Ames case. The Ames case has come to be understood and really defined by Mr. Woolsey, not only about the treason of this one man, but also it speaks to an incompetence at CIA, and it speaks to what Mr. Woolsey calls the culture of the agency, and particularly the culture of the operations directorate, where the spy works. Mr. Woolsey, quite bravely, I think, has criticized this culture for its insularity, for its occasional arrogance, and members of the congressional intelligence committees that oversee the CIA, most of which takes place in secret, behind closed doors, have criticized the agency, and particularly the operations directorate, for almost being apart from the way the rest of the United States and the rest of the U.S. government works. Perhaps that's as it should be, but it has led to some problems.
First call is from Miami. Good morning.
Good morning. I wanted to ask Mr. Godson if the review he spoke of in the 1980s diminished the capacity or the pension of the CIA, excuse me, to operate within the boundaries of the United States, which I understand is forbidden to do by charter.
Well, the purpose of the charter really is to keep the CIA from focusing on foreign adversaries of the United States, and on the whole, it works very well. In the whole history of the past 40 years, there were a few aberrations. There were some, I would say, real abuses, but on the whole, they were fairly minor. They were corrected back in the 1970s, and on the whole, the CIA works well abroad, and it does not, on the whole, work inside the United States. Obviously, there's some overlaps where you have sort of people in the United States coming into the United States that would be foreigners who would be of interest to the CIA, so that, yes, there will be times where the CIA would have to be concerned with events in the United States, or you have some Americans, for example, who visit foreign lands who would be of interest to the American government. We'd want to know what they saw or heard, if they had anything of interest to say, and they often volunteer that kind of information. So there will be some work in the United States with regard to collecting and analyzing of information on foreign lands. However, the main focus of the CIA is abroad. The reforms that I spoke about in the counterintelligence area were very far-reaching. I think they did a lot to improve the system, but as I said, I don't think they went far enough, and there wasn't enough monitoring to see whether those reforms were actually achieving their objectives. The recognition that there were problems in the culture was known. The fact that they actually just didn't go far enough in correcting those weaknesses. But as I said, at the same time, I think we ought to sort of balance off. There were a number of successes. We tend to focus and dwell on failures. We tend to focus on scandal. But we're talking about, thousands of people, most of whom are loyal, most of whom are competent, most of whom are dedicated. They don't earn very much money. Many of them live far, even when they're based in Washington, they have to live in places far out of town because they can't afford to live in the relatively affluent suburbs of Langley and McLean, Virginia. We have a lot of very dedicated people here, and so much as I have been a persistent critic of performance, I don't want to suggest that there haven't been a lot of very good things, a lot of successes, including in the counterintelligence area.
How's the morale, CIA?
People say it's not great right now. The agency has been stung quite a bit by criticism of Congress and hammered in the press for the Ames case, for another case that involves a woman who was regarded as quite a success inside the operations directorate until she ran into what she described as a sort of a macho glass ceiling, and she has sued the agency, and that suit's become public. Part of the problem, as it's been described to me both by officers inside the CIA and by those who oversee the agency, is that the agency is a tool of the President of the United States. It is there primarily to give him the best intelligence in the world, to help him determine what American foreign policy is. That is its primary role in government. People tend to overlook it. And the foreign policy of the United States is a bit adrift these days. We don't know quite where we're going. And in the absence of clear directions from the helmsman, the guys down in the boiler room trying to keep the ship stoked naturally get a little confused and a little worried. Do you think that's fair?
I think that's a very good point you raised, that intelligence is an instrument of policy. It works for policy. It helps to shape policy. It helps the president, as you say, the way we set up the system to shape policy. And it's also an instrument to implement policy. We use it as a tool. For example, the covert action parts, even some of the counterintelligence parts of the agency are used to help influence conditions abroad to make them favorable to American interests. And I do think that in the absence of a coherent policy, it makes it much more difficult. And I think although we managed the transition from Cold War to post-Cold War era fairly well, there was next to no violence. It was an amazing peaceful revolution in the late 1980s, early 1990s here. Now we have to set a new course, and it's very difficult, and we haven't yet got this, and therefore we shouldn't just sort of blame the instrument, as you put it, when we don't in fact have a clear course from the helmsman.
Spring Valley, New York. Good morning.
Good morning. Before I ask my question, Tim Weiner, the couple of articles you've written about Haiti have been exactly on the mark, and I'd like to congratulate you for that. The CIA, drawing a profile of exiled Haitian President Jean-Bertrand Aristide, has caused irreparable damages 2 years ago, and that this profile was drawn by Brian Littell. This was debunked subsequently by many journalists, including the Miami Herald, and yet this profile is still used by many journalists, many commentators, and even the government. The question is, don't you think the CIA is too lenient on some of the employees when even the profiles, their report turned out to be wrong, and yet if it serves the political purpose of the government, they just keep these guys in the agency?
Well, to correct one thing you said, Mr. Littell, who was then the chief analyst for Latin American and the Caribbean, didn't do this profile. He simply delivered or read it. He was the messenger, not the person who wrote it. Psychological profiles of persons whom one has never met are a tricky business. And the business of profiling foreign leaders has come in for quite a bit of criticism as sketchy. Certainly some parts of the profile of President Aristide were demonstrably false. There is a criticism of CIA which may be well-founded, which was made in a fabulous book by a man named Angelo Codevilla, who called Informing Statecraft. Mr. Codevilla served as a Republican staff member of the Senate Intelligence Committee for 8 years. His take on it is that the agency's attitude towards its analyses and the way they write them is, well, we may not always be right, but we're never wrong. That is his criticism, and it may be a fair one.
I think again, you raise a very good point. First, I think in making the point to the caller that one man didn't draw up all the intelligence about Aristide, whether it was right or wrong. Brian Littell shouldn't get the credit or the blame for that. But you raised the larger issue of the kind of analysis that the CIA has been doing. One of the purposes of the CIA was to provide the president with analysis of at foreign events and to help him in policymaking. Now, in very recent times, the CIA, again, recognizing the weaknesses of the past, has engaged in an unusually candid admissions of the weaknesses of its analysis. And one of the bravest bureaucratic things I've seen in recent weeks has been the role that a man by the name of Douglas McKechen, who is the head of the CIA's analysis, has played in, of course, with Jim Woolsey's approval. Woolsey brought him in. They had worked together before. And McKechen, who is a 29-year veteran of the CIA, he's a grandfather, I think, in age, but McKechen has instituted now a series of reforms to change the analytic culture. I think there's a recognition that things are not being done, have not been done as well as the past. You talk about the Codevilla book. There are many other writings that took place in the 1980s, early 1990s, that indicated that there are serious weaknesses. There are different views of the diagnosis of the problem, but I think there's a consensus that things need to be improved. And I think Mr. Woolsey, in his speeches, has recognized this. I think in the Director of Operations, the spy business, where the spies work, and in the Director of Analysis, and also in the Director of Science and Technology, which is also very important, brings together scientific information and uses of science to help us with our intelligence gathering. There's a recognition that we really need to improve. We need to diagnose our weaknesses and get better. It's not that we've done everything wrong, but we should be doing much better, and we should try to do much better.
El Dorado Hills, California. Good morning.
Yeah, I just thought I'd call after listening to the media last night talking about downsizing the CIA now that the Cold War is over. Logic would tell us that if we're downsizing our military, that we need to probably have more intelligence. And I just don't seem to understand how you can downsize the military and downsize your intelligence and really be prepared for something that might happen somewhere else in the world that will impact you.
Thanks for the call. Something you addressed earlier.
Well, I think there's good news and bad news. We are downsizing the military and we are downsizing our intelligence, but we're downsizing our intelligence a little less than we're downsizing the military. So, you can look at it, the bottle half full and half empty. There is a recognition that intelligence is important. It's sort of eyes and ears, and it's better for us to see things before they happen, so we don't have to necessarily have to use military force to avoid that. That's unusual, though, in a democracy. I must say, it's really remarkable. If you look at our history, the history of the United States, great intelligence capability during the Revolutionary War. George Washington, very interested in intelligence. President Washington and his successors basically sort of get rid of most of intelligence. Then, I said, we only build up, really, for World War I in 1917-18, downsize again, practically eliminate the system. I think we had 2 men and a dog in the counterintelligence branch of the Army after World War I. And then, again, rebuild for World War II, although it was a struggle, many people didn't want to. Build up during World War II, and then almost immediately abolish almost everything, not everything, right after World War II. So we shouldn't be too surprised. This is the way democratic culture works. We don't see the need for this. We don't want to spend the money on it. On the other hand, as I said, this time we have been a bit smarter than the past, and we are keeping some kinds of capabilities, and now we're having a debate about what exactly these capabilities should be.
Macon, Georgia. Good morning.
Good morning. First-time caller. Never have gotten through before. The reason I'm calling is I think that the CIA is highly overrated, and it costs the American people billions of dollars over many years since World War I and then on into World War II. And I think many times it causes a great deal of exposure that we wouldn't have otherwise to our secrets. And I'm thinking especially and particularly about one Kim Philby of Britain, who came over here, and the CIA did not figure him out. And we had huge exposure there with he and his friend, what was his name, Burgess. I'd like to ask you to speak to this, and I'll hang up now.
Just to correct one misimpression, the Central Intelligence Agency was founded in 1947. It's a relatively new institution compared to, say, the Department of State. You know, the agency over the years, partly because of its secrecy, partly because, you know, it has done some embarrassing things, and who hasn't, has been blamed for almost every real and imagined failing of American foreign policy. It's become a boogeyman. It's not. It's a large bureaucracy in an identifiable building with road signs leading to it. And part of what's going on now, and I think the Director of Central Intelligence, Jim Woolsey, should get a lot of credit for this, is a demystification of what it does. It's a tool of the president. Most of the people there read magazines and newspapers from abroad and gather intelligence from both open sources and secret sources and try and figure out what's going on in the world. And, you know, as a newspaper man, someone who tries to gather intelligence from open and classified sources and analyze it and figure out what's going on, I don't have a lot of problem with that. The question that the previous caller raised is, well, you know, if we're downsizing the military, we need more intelligence. What everyone agrees is that we need better intelligence, and more may not be better.
I agree. I think, again, well stated. I think there's also a sort of important point to make, and I know that the New York Times and other newspapers make this point, but it sort of somehow gets lost, and that is the CIA is actually a very small part of the total U.S. intelligence budget, the personnel, and so on. The CIA is not the biggest part. It is less than half. The government doesn't publish exactly what its personnel and exactly what the budget is, but all the congressmen who know this budget and all the former directors who have testified about it and spoken in public about it will tell you that the CIA is actually a very small part of the total intelligence collection and even some small part of a great deal of the budgets that go into the intelligence business.
Lake St. Louis, Missouri.
Good morning.
Good morning.
First, I want to comment. We must all remember the CIA had done a great job as worldwide to serve the American interest, and it's thanks to Harry Truman for his great vision for CIA. But also, what's noticeable in the late, perhaps 80s or late 70s, they start to become like, to me, working as individual, not such a change of command to serve the American interest. And you can say that they do not predict Russia was going down since the mid-80s, not after that, you know. So we should understand they have no money no more. Do you think with the new direction we should change CIA from Hollywood scenes to be come to reality work for the public and the tax dollar? Forgot about the Hollywood scene movie which has happened during the Cold War. Thank you.
Well, if I may, I do think there should be actually a change in direction, and I alluded already to a change in the analytical side of the job of analysis. I think there was far too much emphasis placed on prediction, that we expected the CIA to be fortune tellers, to be able to predict all events in the world just because they had access to some secret sources and just because they had some smart people working there. Nobody can be a fortune teller. Nobody has that kind of foreknowledge in the world. And the CIA, unfortunately, almost fed the myth that they were able to do this, and they acted as if they were able to do this. But I think this emphasis on prediction, which is now, of course, catching up with them in that they weren't able to predict a lot of important events that took place in the world, was a mistaken direction for analysis. I think now what you see is an effort now to provide a different kind of analysis, to help the policymaker understand the vulnerabilities of foreign adversaries, to understand how better to neutralize threats to the United States and opportunities to take advantage, which we the United States can use in the future. So you don't have to be a predictor to be able to do that. You just simply have to be a good analyst to understand the dynamics of a foreign society, but don't expect that the CIA or any other intelligence service in the world is going to be able to predict events, especially long-term future events. I don't think any organization can do that.
A question's been faxed to us. Let me ask you both. This is from Janice Fenner in Key Largo. She wants to know if either one of you are familiar with a book about the CIA called Compromise by Terry Reid. She writes.
Yeah, there's, in my opinion, I'm not paid for my opinion, so I apologize. There's a lot of bombast in that book.
Next call is from San Diego. Good morning.
Yes, I think I agree. We need the CIA now more than ever. We say we're groping for a foreign policy. We should always be true to our own purpose, which is the self-determination of people. That's why it was so pathetic to see Clinton in front of the UN asking them to save Sarajevo. I mean, we have thousands of troops nearby Bosnia. We know that we could stop this genocide any day. The treachery of the UN and this terrible embargo, I would be using the CIA if I were president to run guns to those people immediately. We've got this Yeltsin who wants to maintain this old empire. what about the KGB? They're still in power. Why can't we take advantage of all these secrets? There's a new book saying that there was a nuclear sub-commander that was a mole. I mean, why can't we take advantage of what happened to the Stasi and the KGB and find out what went on in Europe?
Well, that's happening. I mean, the last point is don't be sure that all these things aren't happening. You know, the Stasi files, the files of the East German intelligence service, have certainly been gleaned. The use of previously closed and now open sources of information has kept a lot of people busy at CIA. Their problem sometimes is not too little but too much information to assimilate. Like many of us, they work you know, very hard to try and figure out what's going on, and if they can't always figure it out.
Can I just, the caller actually began with a point that we had sort of were talking about earlier, which was that there was an absence of a foreign policy, an absence of a clear-cut series of objectives and means. And then we sort of, the caller drifted off into specifically referring to the CIA. But I mean, I think we would agree that one needs to have a clear-cut policy, and the specific example of Yugoslavia would be an example to me where there is not a consensus in the United States about how to deal with that problem. It's very complicated. There are different views about it inside the executive branch and inside the Congress, and I think it would be very difficult for the CIA to be able to do. The CIA can't do things by itself. It has to be directed by the president, and the congressional intelligence committees ultimately are going to pay the bill, so to speak. And so there has to be a consensus before we can ask the CIA or American intelligence in general to do anything.
Schenectady, New York. Good morning.
Yes, thank you for C-SPAN. I've been trying to get through here for over a year, and this gentleman here that has to... Godson? Is that his name? Mr. Godson there?
Yes.
Yeah. Something going wrong in this country. Now they're cutting down on defense. They're cutting down on the CIA. They're trying to cut everything. Clinton is... I don't know. You have to excuse me for a minute because I'm very, very uptight about this. I believe Woolsey should be fired, for one thing. And I don't believe that our government is telling us the truth. Now, with this Russian thing going on, all of our business going to go over to Russia now? I am getting sick and tired of this president doling out billions and billions and billions of dollars to all these other countries, and especially in Haiti. We should not be there. Now, that soldier that was killed in Haiti, he did not commit suicide.
Thanks for the call.
Well, the caller, I think, addresses a concern that a lot of Americans feel about sort of, you know, problems in the world, the drift in the world. This is not the first time in America that we've had this kind of drift. At the latter part of the 19th century, if I can play the role of historian here, we and other Europeans had this kind of drift. After World War I, we also felt a drift as a country, and we had later the Depression and so on. So in the immediate euphoria of the end of the Cold War, people thought things were going to work out rather well, or many people thought things were going to work out rather well, and now they're not. And so there is a lot of concern, anxiety, and I think the caller reflects that. But she really goes well beyond what we're here to talk about today, and so I'll stop there.
San Antonio, good morning.
Good morning. The guy was talking about how small the CIA is. I watched the hearings that the Oversight Committee held on the secret buildings, the 4 towers that the CIA was building outside of Washington, D.C., and they just out and out lied to keep that secret, so you can't trust the things. And another thing that I want to say, I would like to know if they question Free, because he was head of the CIA when a lot of this Ames stuff was going on.
Thank you.
Two misimpressions the caller has. The now famous stealth building constructed outside Washington is the new headquarters of the National Reconnaissance Office, which is a secret agency, a procurement agency that builds spy satellites. and it's not the CIA's building. Now, part of this confusion arises from the fact that Mr. Woolsey, as Director of Central Intelligence, wears two hats. He is the chairman of the board of all U.S. intelligence agencies, and he is the CEO of the CIA. It's perhaps a natural confusion, and a lot of people don't understand the difference. He has to wear two hats, and I'm sure he wishes he had two heads sometimes, because it's a huge job, each of them. The other misimpression, I think the caller is confusing William Webster, who was the head of the FBI in the Reagan administration, who took over the CIA in 1987 after Bill Casey, his predecessor, died of a brain tumor. And part of the concerns of the Ames case arise from a lack of coordination between FBI, which is responsible for catching spies in this country, and CIA during Judge Webster's tenure at CIA. There were some missed signals there.
We have about 15 minutes left in our program to tell you a little bit more about our two guests. Tim Weiner is a Washington correspondent for the New York Times. He won a Pulitzer Prize for national reporting in 1988 for his coverage of the black budget, of the Pentagon budget. Is also the author of the paperback book out called Blank Check about the CIA and the Pentagon. Roy Godson, as I mentioned earlier, is president of the National Strategy Information Center, also a professor of government at Georgetown University. He serves as coordinator of the Consortium for the Study of Intelligence. He's written, co-authored, or edited 16 books and articles on intelligence and national security, and also a consultant to security agencies.
I have worked for the White House and other parts of the government on trying to identify weaknesses in the American intelligence system and trying to come up with solutions or ways of improving them.
Tuolumne, California. Good morning.
Morning. I'd like to know why this guy Ames hasn't been tried and executed for the rotten traitor that he is, and also he's a murderer, since I guess he's responsible for the death of 10 agents. That's all I got to say. Thanks a lot.
Well, he has been tried, of course. He pled guilty and agreed to cooperate with the government so that we could do a full damage assessment to try to figure out how we did it and what some of the weaknesses were, and so to improve our system in the future. Yes, it's sort of understandable that people would feel outraged that he can spend his life in the relative comfort of a prison, and others who he sent to their deaths, of course, had another fate. But that is our system, and I think everybody understands the outrage. But the system of justice did work.
Tim Weiner.
Well, also at the time he committed these crimes, we did not have a death penalty for treason. We traditionally don't execute people for treason in times of peace. But I've spent about 8 hours interviewing Ames, and he knows that he has blood on his hands, and he knows that he's destroyed not only his own life, but the life of his wife, who is going to be sentenced to probably more than a few years in prison later this month, or in October, and of his 5-year-old child. He has a growing awareness of the enormity of his treason, and he has to live with that in a solitary cell for the rest of his natural life.
How long did it take to arrange the interview?
I had put in a request to Ames and his lawyer after he pleaded guilty in April. It took about 2 months, and we wound up with a face-to-face interview and then a series of telephone calls that he spontaneously made from his prison cell where he was being held in the Alexandria, Virginia City Jail for the convenience of the debriefers from CIA and FBI who interviewed him at length and got him to confess to what he could remember of his many betrayals of information and of people.
Manchester, California. Good morning.
That's Tennessee.
I'm sorry. Go right ahead.
Yes. I wanted to go back to the history of the CIA, like back to Iran and Mossadegh in the 50s, Vietnam and the disasters that the CIA had there. supporting of every right-wing dictator that said they were anti-communist, and how those disasters turned out. Like the head, what was his name? Gates, head of the CIA for Bush. Was that his name?
He was, for a part of the time, head of the CIA for Bush, yeah.
Yeah, and he wouldn't believe his own analysis. Russia was falling apart, and they thought that his own analysis. We've never, during this 50-year period, we never supported the middle people in any of these countries. We went to the extremes.
Well, I think I'd like to make 2 points with respect to the It's an interesting subject. But the first point is that if the United States and the CIA took certain positions, it was because the government of the United States took those positions. The CIA is a tool. It doesn't make policy. It was not a rogue elephant. Senator Frank Church in the 1970s accused the CIA of being a rogue elephant. He ran an investigation for 18 months, the biggest investigation ever of an intelligence agency in the history of the world, and concluded he was mistaken. The CIA was responsive to the will of the presidents and of the Congress of the United States. There were some exceptions, but on the whole, this was the case. Now, with regard to the specifics, though, about did the government of the United States and did the CIA particularly only support extremists? Well, I don't think that's true. I don't think the record shows this. In fact, I'll give you one major example, and that was the support to trade union and socialist forces in the world, which began in 1948 and continued for a number of decades, and that we helped moderate labor, trade union, and social democratic and socialists to compete with the communists. That was the reason, was to keep the communists out. We believed that they would be much more competitive to sort of get to the center and the center left. And so therefore a lot of aid went to a lot of center-left forces. And there are a number of conservative senators in the 1980s who were very unhappy about that. And when there was some question about doing this in places like El Salvador and Nicaragua and so on, they raised serious questions about, because they were conservatives and didn't believe that those forces would be effective. So I think the policy of the United States was set by the government, not by the CIA. And we did, in fact, as a government and as the CIA, support democratic moderate forces as well as some extremists.
I think the point should be made that the thousands of foreign politicians and foreign parties, and in some cases foreign guerrilla forces, that CIA has supported over the decades were anti-communist forces, and they ranged from moderate to the extreme right across a large spectrum of politics. And again, to underscore what Dr. Godson said, the impression that the CIA was a rogue elephant has seeped into the culture. It's, with a very, very, very few exceptions, it is not. If there was a rogue, it was the mahout, the elephant driver.
Fairfax, Virginia.
Yes, I'm a first-time caller. They're still talking, aren't they?
No, go right ahead.
Oh, okay, fine. I'm a first-time caller, and the caller just before me kind of preempted some of my questions, but I found it amazing that they could get this far into the program and not discuss the CIA's role in deposing democratically elected officials such as Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, Mossadegh in Iran, putting in dictatorial governments in their place, causing a dictatorship to go up in Guatemala, in Cuba, in Chile, etc., etc.
Tim Weiner.
Well, a quibble. Patrice Lumumba was not democratically elected. He rose to the top of a very chaotic situation in what was then the Congo and now Zaire. It has been ascribed to the CIA, and in some cases correctly, that in carrying out the orders of the government to depose this or that leader, and such revolutions were accomplished in Guatemala in '53, in Iran in '54. We installed the Shah, who fell to Khomeini in 1979. And elsewhere in the world, the CIA has acted like, Caesar's legions overthrowing governments right and left. We don't do that anymore. It has not proved useful. It has proved embarrassing at times. cannot be, we really need to make this point, that the CIA acts, and on occasion its violations of American law, were carried out at the instructions of the President of the United States, and that it is not some sort of rogue. Where it sinned, and it has been in the service of the White House.
Right. I agree completely with that, that general view. The point really, though, needs to be made here for today. I mean, we can go into the past, but it's sort of an ironical point that's being made here, and that is that people are criticizing the intelligence community for failure to act competently, and we're now starting to get criticism of the intelligence community for not having overthrown, for example, General Cedras. Mr. Weiner's newspaper last week carried a story by a columnist, or an article by a columnist, saying that what we really need is an effective CIA department of clean tricks. And by the way, and I think he's right. I think we have become very weak, and we do not have the ability to support friends and neutralize adversaries, and therefore we have in fact had to resort to military force. And I would give you the examples of Panama as an example, where instead of arranging for Panamanians to get rid of General Noriega, I'm not saying kill him, but just to get rid of him, but there was of course the danger that he might be killed, we instead launched an invasion.
Dr. Godson, just to underscore that point, the problem that the agency has gotten into in the past is that Noriega was a paid asset of American intelligence for some years. He rose to power, and then we find ourselves in the position of having to take him out. Sometimes the agency has, and there's a very strong argument that it should, recruited and paid young, up-and-coming, promising military officers and politicians abroad, and made them assets. This has happened in Haiti, for example. And then it finds itself in an embarrassing position when these, for example, Noriega, rise to power and start sort of thumbing their nose at the American government. An argument can be made that some of these difficult situations are self-created.
If you could just hold for a minute, we'll get Seattle and's been waiting. Thanks, Seattle. Go ahead.
Well, this leads into my question or comment very directly. I am not terribly uncomfortable with the CIA if it passively gathered information, but the idea that we are covertly going into these third world countries or other countries, and especially at the whim of whoever is in the White House, makes me very uncomfortable. I had heard a report a few years ago that a couple of years after we had finished the war with Iraq, that we had stopped funding to counterfeit bills to send counterfeit money in there to undermine the government. And it seems like our principles ought to stand on their own merit without all of this kind of subterfuge, and I would like these gentlemen's comment on that. Thank you.
Well, let me begin. I think we're talking about here the fact that the United States government has a number of interests in the world. For example, we want to stop terrorists killing Americans and hurting others throughout the world. We want to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons. We want to stop gangsters proliferating weapons. We want to stop rogue states developing weapons like North Korea and maybe even selling them to others at a later point. We want to stop drug cartels from poisoning our streets. There are a number of interests we have in the world. Now then, you'd have to decide how you want to try to deal with that. One way to do that is sort of through diplomacy, try to get other states to do the work for us, to encourage them to do that, and so on. That's one way, and we do use that instrument. The second way is to use military force. If we find ourselves in a situation where General Noriega or the leaders of Colombia happen to be collaborating with drug dealers, we could invade those countries. Or in the case of Haiti, where we found a general that was undemocratic, we could invade those countries. The alternative way to do that is to use a variety of means, economic, diplomatic, and covert action, to do that. Trying to influence events in other parts of the world without acknowledging our involvement is what I refer to as covert action. That is not done by the president on a whim. The president has to sign a finding about that. He has to report that to the congressional intelligence committees, and they ultimately have to fund these programs. The president cannot do this on a whim. He cannot do it. He's not a rogue elephant, and the CIA is not a rogue elephant. We have a series of checks and balances. But when the United States decides that it needs to do something, it would be sort of foolish to me to have to use military force, such as an invasion in Panama, or to send 20,000 troops into Haiti, if in fact one could have done this with less violent means, albeit what we would call covert action.
Tim Weiner, we have about 30 seconds. Is the Ames case over with this disciplining of about a dozen?
The Ames case, insofar as it dealt with his treason, is over. Mr. Woolsey's decision to send letters of reprimand to 11 former and present CIA officers, to him closes the case. To the extent that the CIA's own investigation of the case revealed problems, deep problems inside the agency, Mr. Woolsey is moving to address them.